scheduled for now. Actually, this week, you noticed we start dealing with an organization that is extremely important in terms of security, an alliance that has been there for quite a few years, that has also undergone a couple of changes in the last couple of years. And obviously, we see transformations continuously and also maybe an extension of its activities. So this week, we are very happy to have a couple of lectures in our course on NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and to also now have this possibility to have a live discussion. Let me start introducing the persons that are participating today in this live discussion. And welcome to all of you who watch this from further away. We have with us today our guest. Very important, he just gave a lecture for people live here in The Hague and is now ready to answer questions that we have in our MOOC online. It is Shea from NATO. Very much welcome, Shea. Thank you for joining us. And let me say that Shea has been a NATO spokesperson for several years, so actually has been commenting on several of the activities. Some of you may have seen that live or online. And then, obviously now, he is in the division of emerging security challenges and is very much dealing with that topic. Okay, thank you so much for joining us. The participants in our MOOC that I have the pleasure to introduce to you today are Jessica, who is from Hawaii. Hello, Jessica. And
Hello.
we have Michael from the US. Very nice that you joined. We had plans to have a third participant who is actually living in Afghanistan. He has some issues right now. It seems to be weather conditions that make the connection a bit difficult. He may be joining us nonetheless in the course of this discussion. And if that doesn't work, we'll maybe have his question in another way channeled to us. So let me start out. Jessica, you had prepared a question. Please take the floor.
Oh, thank you. First of all, it's wonderful to have this opportunity, and I thank you all at Leiden University and Dr. Shea for taking this question. Doctor, my question for you is, NATO has continually opposed agreements to work with the Collective Security Treaty Organization, although it's invested a lot of time and money in counterterrorism. So how is this choice a more secure option when it encourages the CSTO and SCO to aggressively pursue their own counter-institutions, advocating a multipolar Cold War hybrid, respectively?
There we go.
Yeah.
First of all, delighted to see you. I think if I've understood correctly, you had to get up very early in the morning, so thank you very much for that. I feel very flattered and appreciative. The answer to your question is that, as you know, NATO has relations with many other international organizations. But in the case of the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, we have good bilateral relations with all of the countries that constitute that organization. We have partnership arrangements under the Partnership for Peace. We cooperate extensively with all of those countries individually on Afghanistan, for instance. You mentioned terrorism as well as that, border security, environmental issues, science, and the rest. And the view of NATO, and the NATO ambassadors have discussed this issue on several occasions, is that we do not want, if I can put it this way, to exchange those good bilateral relations with many of these countries in the Caucasus, for example, in Central Asia, to exchange those relations for one single institution-to-institution relationship with the CSTO. We don't want the CSTO to become a kind of monopolizing gateway between NATO and the individual countries, particularly, let's be frank, given the very major leadership role that Russia plays in the CSTO organization, which could potentially therefore make Russia into a filter between NATO and these countries. The countries of Central Asia, the Caucasus, are sovereign, independent states. They can choose what type of foreign relations they want to have. So that's really the reason up until now. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we don't have a dialogue with the CSTO. We've participated in some of the meetings on Afghanistan, for instance, that they've held in the past in Russia. And we've also had sometimes the CSTO representative coming along to meetings of our Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, where we meet with all of the NATO partners. But the idea of developing, as Russia has sometimes suggested, a formal relationship between NATO and the CSTO is something that we've not agreed to up until now.
Thank you very much for your answer, Dr. Shea, at this point. Jessica, did you have a follow-up?
Yes, actually. My question is, what are you, just tying into the last question, once again, what are your concerns as imposing a Cold War hybrid? Are there any concerns with NATO as far as how this balances the multipolar world as far as the SCO? Does that concern you at all, that that we once again will possibly balance Western and the East powers?
Well, your question is a very good one. NATO spent, as you know, 60 years trying to overcome the Cold War and the division of Europe. Nobody looks back on that period, believe me, with any kind of nostalgia. It was a very dangerous period. It was a very difficult period. It was an expensive period in terms of the amount of money that had to be spent on armed forces and the rest. It rested, as you remember, on a nuclear equilibrium, a balance of terror, and so I don't believe that anybody in their right mind would be nostalgic for that or want to go back to that period. And you're right, the multipolar world is one which NATO favors. It's a world in which we can have a dialogue with many, many countries around the world that are not members of NATO, countries that don't even want to be members of NATO. It's also a world in which we are free to partner with many other international organizations as well. And the most important thing, however, about that multipolar world is freedom. Is that you do not have to join an alliance if you don't want to. You can be neutral if you want to. You can aspire to join NATO if you want to. That, in other words, countries, unlike the Cold War, are not the victims of history or geography. I'm a neighbor of this country. I'm a small country next to a great power. Therefore, I will always be dominated by that great power. That great power will always control my foreign policy. That was the old block-to-block system. And also, that Cold War was based on the notion that you couldn't have multiple identities. For example, I'm a London Cockney, I'm British, I'm also a European, and I feel probably like you do, very much a citizen of the world. In other words, I can live with different identities. My European identity is not in contradiction with my British identity or my English background or culture. And similarly, I think it's good that a country like Turkey, for example, can be a member of NATO, but also a member of the Organization of the Islamic Conference. And now, Turkey has applied to have a status, observer status, participation in what you mentioned, the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So it's not a question that if you're in my camp, you must be an adversary. I think that this idea of choice, of where you want to be, and building bridges across these cultures by having sort of simultaneous memberships in many organizations is a good thing in drawing people together. But I also believe that the principle of having relations with countries for NATO is very important. As I mentioned in reply to your previous question, I don't think we want to see a situation where one country says, if you want to talk to my neighbors, you have to talk to them through this organization in which I played a dominant role. Because believe me, that would be the beginning of a return to that kind of Cold War, you know, us and them, you're either with me or you're against me, that kind of bipolar system, which although some nostalgics think that it was a great provider of stability and security, I don't believe that. I think it was a very dangerous system, and therefore that type of multipolarity that you described is something that we want to preserve even in the more difficult circumstances of today.
Thank you very much for this extensive answer. I believe that, Michael, you had prepared questions, obviously on a very topical theme right now that interests a lot of people around the world. Michael, please feel free, go ahead to ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, and good afternoon again, Dr. Shea. My question is, the Russian law body in 2001 made a law that said it can absolve old Soviet territories into the Russian Federation, and this was their justification for annexing Crimea in the first place. So what is NATO's view on that law, and how are you handling that with new Ukrainian President Poroshenko and also President Putin of Russia?
Okay, well, you're right, Michael. That's obviously a very hot and topical subject. I think my view, and I believe it's the view of the NATO allies as well, is that we cannot use history or a selective interpretation of history to claim that we have a right to overturn internationally recognized borders. You know, for example, a country like France, because Alsace and Lorraine belonged to Germany between 1870 and 1914. Would that justify the Germans today in saying that everybody in Alsace-Lorraine who happens to speak German, and because Alsace and Lorraine 2 centuries ago or 150 years ago was part of Germany, that therefore those provinces should be returned to Germany? No, of course not. It would be the end of the European Union, and it would be a recipe for constant instability. I just give that as one example, but if you look around Europe, Michael, you could think of 100 similar examples, because in European history, no country today, almost no country today, is exactly within the borders, has exactly the mix of different nationalities and languages and groups that it had 100 years ago or 200 years ago or 300 years ago. So one precedent could be used to create endless precedents. It's a recipe for constant instability, because Europe today is a Europe of diversity. That's good, you know, remembering our previous conversation regarding diversity and different identities. We have situations where many people speak the language of another country. I live in Belgium, where the southern half speaks French, the northern half speaks Dutch. There is also a group of German speakers. So you could see, if you start sort of saying that I have the right to give up my passport to anybody in another country that speaks a variety of my language, then we would have conflicts until the end of humanity. So no, it's a very, 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 very bad precedent to believe that you can sort of leapfrog over international law and recognize borders through the abuse, really, the manipulation and misuse of history. And you know, the same argument could be used also against Russia, which probably more than any other country in the last centuries, often in very tragic circumstances, has changed its border. So this is not something that we welcome, and NATO has made it clear that we will not recognize the de facto and illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia or any other potential land grab that Russia might want to make. At the end of the day, the Russians have to really also think if this kind of perpetual uncertainty and instability serves their own security in the long run.
Thank you very much for this answer. Actually, Michael, did you have a follow-up question?
Yes, I did, Professor. May I ask it now?
Please go ahead, Michael. Excuse me.
Okay, Dr. Shea, from what I've read of the situation, it seems that, I mean, for all intents and purposes, Russia, as petty as it may seem, has a higher stake in Crimean territory, with the majority of their population being ethnic Russians, and they also have a Black Sea naval fleet on the Crimean coast. So would that come into play if there were any mediation talks being made between Ukraine and Russia over Crimean territory?
Well, again, your question is a very good one, Michael. I think, first of all, let's look at the facts. I mean, whatever President Putin may say about, all Ukrainian nationalists being fascists, or anybody who is opposing, the de facto split of Ukraine is a fascist. This is complete nonsense. It's total nonsense. The right-wing parties in the Ukrainian elections, the presidential candidate in the Ukrainian elections, who came from Svoboda, the right-wing party, got less than 2% of the vote. Opinion polls in eastern Ukraine show that although some of the Russian speakers may not be totally happy with the government from Kiev, and there are certainly lots of improvements that can be done, and President Poroshenko has said that he will reach out to offer the Russian speakers in Ukraine a more participation, a better deal. So there's always room for improvement. But the opinion polls show overwhelmingly that a tiny percentage of the Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine want to go back to Russia. They don't. They want to stay part of Ukraine. And I think that maybe from President Putin's perspective, the lack of a really spontaneous popular uprising in eastern Ukraine, which maybe he was expecting, has been a disappointment. And maybe I'm speculating here, but that's maybe one of the reasons why he's had to sort of, send tanks across the border and insert his own forces, because there has been a complete lack of any kind of spontaneous uprising to join Russia. Ukrainians know that although their country isn't perfect, they can at least determine who governs them. They are free, they can speak freely, they can participate in elections, they have a choice of which TV station, etc. they want to watch. So I think we have to look at the facts sometimes through this sort of fog of propaganda, which is what we're experiencing at the moment. The other thing, coming back to what you asked me a moment ago, is that we want European solutions. Countries can live within their borders, have those borders guaranteed by international law, yet still travel across them freely. I mean, I know sometimes that every day lots of people travel from one country in the European Union to work in another country. Lots of Germans go to work in Zurich or Basel in Switzerland and come back in the evening. Being in one country does not mean to say that we can't have good links with others. In my own country, the United Kingdom, the Catholic minority that lives in Northern Ireland has very close relations with the people who live in the Irish Republic. The border is open, they go back and forth and so on. So this idea of President Putin that somehow, you're a Russian speaker in Ukraine, and if you are not part of Russia, you're somehow going to have your human rights taken away from you and be persecuted. It's total nonsense. And I like often to quote an American judge who used to say everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but everybody is not entitled to their own facts. The other thing is that the fact that the Russians, you mentioned the Black Sea Fleet in Sebastopol and Crimea, the Russians had these ships there, based there, was part of a bilateral agreement between Ukraine and Russia, which was due to last until 2042. And it's all right having those forces there if it's part of a bilateral agreement. But that agreement has been violated, of course, and Russia has illegally nationalized about 40 ships of the Ukrainian fleet, as well as taken over many of their gas fields, for example. It's a big economic loss, which were just off the coast. So the important thing is that if you are going to have your forces in another country, like the Americans have forces, of course, in Europe, it is a part of a bilateral voluntary decision, and is not something which is imposed by force.
Thank you very much. We could easily go on this discussion, but I think we do a slight switch right now geographically. Actually, we had Dr. Said Khan from Afghanistan join us for a moment. Unfortunately, it seems that the connection again is a bit interrupted, but we have his question. And so I'll simply present it approximately the way it has just been forwarded to us. Essentially, the question will be, how will the withdrawal of NATO in 2016 affect Afghanistan and obviously NATO policy? And the other question, of course, linked to this, wouldn't that be too early? This is Dr. Said Khan's question.
Well, thank you, Dr. Zaikan. Sorry I can't see you on the screen, but it's good that you've been able to contact us, so welcome. First of all, NATO, the United States, the Europeans, we are not going to abandon Afghanistan. What we are doing at the moment, at the end of 2014, is not leaving the country, but is transitioning from ISAF, the very large multinational stabilization force, as you know, to a smaller force, which is going to be focusing on education, training, mentoring for the Afghan forces. President Obama has set a deadline of 2016, it's true, for the American participation in this mission, because it's his judgment that 2 years would be enough for the Afghan forces to be fully autonomous and fully independent. And indeed, already this year, we see Afghan forces which are much more in the lead. They're responsible for 90% now of all of the operations. They showed in dealing with various terrorist incidents in Kabul that they are very good at responding. They showed in terms of the elections, providing security, that they're increasingly professional, well trained, well organized. So another 2 years of effort should be sufficient for those forces to stand on their own 2 feet. The other thing, by the way, is that you don't set a deadline. Let's be frank. People think, oh well, we don't have to do anything. The international forces were always going to be there. We can rely upon them. We don't have to be responsible ourselves, and that's not good. Sometimes if you don't set a deadline, your student never produces the essay. So to some degree, deadlines are important to give people a sense of their own responsibility and how they have to energize their own efforts. But even after 2016, I am personally convinced that NATO will continue to stay engaged with Afghanistan. We have a partnership program. One of the things that we're going to do at the NATO summit in Wales is launch a new form of the NATO-Afghanistan bilateral partnership. Afghanistan will participate in the various partnership activities that we have. So it's not a question that we will abandon the country, but it is a question of going through the various stages of giving Afghanistan, once again, what it wants, what President Karzai always tells us he wants, and I'm sure it will be the same with his successor. Afghans in charge of Afghan security, and Afghanistan in the lead, and the country increasingly being returned fully to governance by Afghans. Anything less would not be progress and would not be normality.
Thank you very much for this answer. Thank you very much. Actually, it turns out that Dr. Khan managed to come in. Now, I'm not entirely sure, Dr. Khan, whether you were able to hear most of the response, but very briefly, let us get you into the picture. Dr. Khan, were you able to hear Dr. Shea's response, and is there a follow-up question that you would have? Sorry, it seems that we lost him again. Okay, if the BSA is signed, that is what Dr. Khan actually writes to us right now, while he is unfortunately unable to come into the discussion with his own connection. Will that actually change the course of NATO policy? This is the follow-up question that Dr. Khan wanted to ask.
Well, thanks, Dr. Cam, for that. Sorry I can't hear you directly, but thank you, Madeline, for passing that on. The answer is the BSA is absolutely fundamental, the bilateral security agreement. This is a standard practice in any kind of military assistance mission. It regulates many legal and administrative issues, and all NATO countries, not just the United States, all NATO countries have made it clear to Kabul that we can only stay on with the new mission if there is a SOFA for the Americans, a status of forces agreement for NATO, and all of the presidential candidates, particularly the two who were in the runoff election last Saturday, Abdullah and Ashraf Ghani, both of them have said that as soon as they are elected, they will sign this agreement. The agreement both between the United States and Kabul and NATO countries and NATO partner countries, those countries that are not NATO members but which have offered to contribute troops to the Resolute Support follow-on mission, all of them have said that we are now, pretty much satisfied that technically speaking, the agreement has been negotiated. So the signature can follow very quickly. It seems from what I hear that we will have to wait maybe 1 month before the votes are counted and we know who has won the presidential contest. But hopefully by the time of the NATO summit in Wales at the beginning of September, this BSA will be signed. We can welcome the new Afghan president there, and in the meantime we are anticipating that the BSA will be signed. The United States has already announced the number of troops, 9,800, that it's willing to leave in Afghanistan, so we're planning for the mission. But I have to be clear, if we are also planning for a possible withdrawal from Afghanistan in the eventuality that the bilateral security agreement would not be signed. This is not our choice, it's not our preferred option, but it also makes clear that we cannot stay beyond the 31st of September 2014 in Afghanistan unless this agreement is signed. But I'm optimistic. As I've said, the two candidates have both made it clear that they will go along and sign it, and so hopefully we can get this done in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you very much for this answer, and I hope, even though it was not exactly possible to get into the discussion, that you were able, Dr. Khan, to get the answers provided by Dr. Shea. At this point, unfortunately, we are already moving into the last minutes of this online discussion. I do, at the end of this discussion, want to ask a very short other question, actually, to Jessica, and then get back to Dr. Shea for a couple of maybe final words before we conclude. The short question, Jessica, is your time zone must be very different from our time zone. What time is it for you right now?
Oh, I missed the second half of the question.
Okay, then let me just actually reveal the secret. It is in the middle of the night because you are located in Hawaii. So thank you. That is true devotion, being true devotion being actually in this course. Now, what we would like to do at the very end now of our online discussion, I would like to give Dr. Shea the possibility to maybe say a few final words about what you think is important, and of course also in terms of the summit, could it be that there are some very important points that you would like to stress yourself?
Well, thank you very much, Madeline. First of all, I'd like to thank your three guests today, particularly Jessica, who obviously has got up in the middle of the night. It's truly impressive, but Dr. Cam and Michael as well for joining us. I've been very glad to have the questions, and I don't know if I've given good answers, but I have honestly done my best to answer the questions fully. We are obviously in a difficult age, not the age that we would have hoped to live in, but let's face it, no generation gets to choose its epoch. It just has to deal with the problems that it finds on its path. And at the moment, it's true that we are in a challenging time. We have Russia, Crimea, the reassertion of military power, the violation of borders, land grabs, what John Kerry called the unfortunate return to 19th century geopolitics, things that we'd hoped to leave behind us. We've also got, obviously, in the world too, many transnational threats like international terrorism. I was talking about this, which we also hoped would disappear with the death of Osama bin Laden, but Al-Qaeda is very resilient and is now making a comeback in the Middle East, in North Africa. Look at the situation in Syria and Iraq today. We've got weapons of mass destruction proliferating. We've got a very sophisticated cyber crime and cyber attack networks at a time where we're increasingly depending for our economic growth on advanced information technology. There are many failed and failing states in the world which are not able to provide even basic services for their citizens. So it's true, if you wanted to choose your age, you may have wanted to live 20 or 30 years ago when we were living in the euphoria of the fall of communism and the fall of the Berlin Wall, maybe more than today. But we're in the situation we're in, but the good news is that we do have NATO as an organization which not only brings Europe and North America together, but all of those partners that I mentioned, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, who have been with us, Sweden, Finland, Malaysia, in Afghanistan, and therefore we do have the basis to go through this difficult age with security. But it's not going to be easy. Europe and the United States are going to have to stick together. We have to solve some of our difficult problems of democracy, of economics, social well-being, to regenerate a bit of confidence in the liberal democratic model at a time when it's challenged. And unfortunately, we may not want to have to increase our defense budgets, but we have to recognize that being able to protect ourselves with secure military forces is still, you know, the fundamental investment that every government has to make. So tough choices. Hillary Clinton has just brought out her autobiography, which she sort of calls Tough Choices, and it's true, we've got some tough choices ahead, but we mustn't, you know, fall into doom and gloom and pessimism. We just have to realize that the security challenges are real. We can't go to bed at night and dream them away, but if we keep NATO strong and stick together, stay united, we'll get through this period, hopefully to better times ahead.
Thank you very much for these closing remarks. This brings us to the end of our live discussion today. Let me thank Jessica, let me thank Zaid from far away at this point, Michael, and of course Dr. Shea. Thank you so much for having participated. This was an interview in the framework of the course, the massive open online course, The Changing Global Order. Thank you all for having watched our interview, and thank you for your participation. Goodbye.